On the morning of the 7th of November 1868, a work train of the Union Pacific Railroad sat idling on a stretch of track near the base of the Rocky Mountains in southern Wyoming. The time was 9:14 a.m. The locomotive, a 440 American type, had been specially outfitted with extra brake system pipes and a heavier boiler. The crew consisted of 12 men, the engineer, the fireman, a foreman, and 9 laborers. Their task was not glamorous. They were to bring a load of iron rails and spikes up to a grading camp that had been cut into the side of a ridge just below Sherman's summit. That summit, at elevation 8,247 feet, would become the highest point on the entire transcontinental railroad. But on that November morning, the summit was still 1,000 feet above them and the grade was steep. The engineer pulled the throttle. The train lurched forward at 9:17 a.m. Everything seemed normal. The wheels bit into the track, the engine labored, the smoke was thick and black. Only a few minutes later, something was off. At 9:23 a.m., the engineer noticed the speed was dropping. He opened the throttle further. The engine responded, but the train did not accelerate. Instead, it slowed. He glanced at the pressure gauge. Steam pressure was at 135 pounds per square inch. The fireman threw in more coal. The engine chugged harder. The grade was now about 2.2%, a serious climb for any locomotive at that time. The engineer checked the water level. Normal. He signaled to the fireman to open the blower to create a better draft. The fireman obeyed. The firebox roared. The train gained a little speed, then lost it again. At 9:28 a.m., the train stopped altogether. The drive wheels spun on the rail, screeching. The engineer shut the throttle and applied the brakes. The train held on the grade, but barely. He looked back. The rail cars were still coupled. Nothing seemed broken. He told the fireman to get out and check the track ahead. The fireman stepped down, walked forward, and saw the problem. A light snow had fallen overnight and frozen into a thin layer of black ice on the rail. The locomotive could not get traction. The temperature was 24 degrees Fahrenheit. The foreman climbed down from the rear. He had been in the Rockies for 3 months. He knew the snows came early. He also knew that if they did not move the train, they would block the only supply line to the grading camp ahead. The camp had 200 men waiting for those rails. Without them, the progress would stop for the winter. The foreman ordered the laborers to spread sand on the rails from the engine forward. The men grabbed burlap sacks of sand from the tender. They walked ahead 200 feet, 300 spreading sand by hand. At 9:36 a.m., the engineer tried again. The throttle opened. The wheels grabbed. The train lurched forward at walking speed. The men walked alongside, continuing to sand the rails. For the next 20 minutes, the train ascended at a crawl. At 9:57 a.m., it reached a flatter section of the grade, and the engineer increased speed to 5 miles per hour. The immediate crisis was over. But the experience was a microcosm of the larger problem. The Rocky Mountains were a barrier that pushed back against every attempt to cross them. What happened that morning was not unique. For the Union Pacific Railroad, building a transcontinental line across the Rocky Mountains had been a series of such moments, strung together over 2 years of construction. The Rockies did not yield easily. From the moment the first surveyors arrived in 1863, the mountains had exerted their influence. The survey teams, led by Grenville Dodge, were tasked with finding a route through the Front Range. They worked in summer and winter. Dodge himself had walked the ground, climbing ridges, mapping passes, calculating grades. The mountains forced him to choose a path that was not the shortest but the most forgiving. The route ultimately followed the Medicine Bow River Valley, climbed through Sherman Pass, and then descended into the Laramie Plains. Even then, the grades averaged nearly 2% for long stretches. That was considered the maximum for steam locomotives of the era. Any steeper, and the trains could not carry enough freight. The construction itself was shaped by the terrain. Tunnels had to be blasted through granite. Bridges had to span deep ravines. The Dale Creek Bridge, built just 2 months before the work train incident, was a wooden trestle that stood 130 feet high and stretched 650 feet across a canyon. It was the tallest bridge in the world at that time. The men who built it worked with ropes and hand tools, hammering timbers into place while the wind whipped through the gorge. The bridge was completed on the 4th of July, 1868, and within 2 months, the wood began to rot in the mountain moisture. It had to be reinforced. The Rockies forced constant maintenance, but the railroad was only one part of the story. The mountains shaped the American West in deeper, older ways. Before the railroad, the Rockies had been a natural boundary that directed the movement of people, animals, and water. To understand how, we have to look back further. The Rocky Mountain Range runs north-south for 3,000 miles from Canada into New Mexico. It forms a spine through the continent. To the west, the climate is drier, the soil thinner. To the east, the plains stretch out flat and fertile. The mountains block moisture from the Pacific, creating a rain shadow. The eastern side gets less precipitation than the western side. This single fact determined where settlers could farm, where rivers would flow, and where cities could grow. Explorers who crossed the Rockies in the early 19th century described them as a wall. The Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804 to 1806 spent months trying to find a passage. On the 12th of September 1805, the party reached the crest of the Bitterroot Mountains, a subrange of the Rockies. Meriwether Lewis wrote in his journal that the view was tremendous. They had struggled through dense forest, snow, and steep slopes and had nearly run out of food. The mountains were not just a physical obstacle, they were a psychological barrier. For the next 60 years, the Rockies slowed westward expansion. Most pioneers going to California or Oregon followed routes that went around the range, through the southern passes or the northern gaps, rather than directly over the highest peaks. The Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Mormon Trail all skirted the Rockies or crossed them at low elevation passes like South Pass in Wyoming, which is only 7,400 feet high. Even then, the trails were arduous. Wagons broke down. Livestock died. Travelers wrote of the relentless wind, the thin air, the sudden storms. The discovery of gold in Colorado in 1858 changed that. Prospectors flooded into the Front Range, and the need for faster, more reliable transportation became urgent. The railroad companies saw the opportunity, but the Rockies did not cooperate. The Denver Pacific Railroad, the Kansas Pacific, the Union Pacific all had to contend with the same terrain. The cost of construction was enormous. A single mile of track through the mountains could cost $50,000, 4 times the cost on the plains. Tunnels required dynamite and days of work. The railroad companies brought in Chinese laborers, Irish immigrants, and veterans of the Civil War, all willing to work for low wages in dangerous conditions. Avalanches killed scores of men. Rockfalls crushed equipment. The mountains took a toll in lives. The railroads that finally made it through the Rockies changed the West. They brought settlers, supplies, and markets. They allowed cattle ranchers to ship beef to the East Coast. They carried timber from the mountains to build houses on the plains. They transported ore from mines in Colorado and Montana. The shape of the American West, with its dispersed cities, its reliance on extractive industries, its network of rail lines following mountain passes, is a direct result of the Rocky Mountains. The mountains forced those patterns. Investigators of history, looking back at the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, found that the single most decisive factor was the elevation of the passes. Every decision about the route, the grade, the length of tunnels, the strength of bridges came back to the mountains. The Union Pacific initially planned to cross the Rockies near the present-day border of Colorado and Wyoming, but the terrain was too steep. Dodge chose the Medicine Bow route because it offered a gentler ascent, but still required extensive earthwork. The system of surveying, mapping, and grading was based on trial and error. Early surveys often missed the most efficient paths. One surveyor in 1865 spent 3 weeks climbing a ridge only to discover that the route was impassable for a railroad. The mountains could hide their secrets. The question of how the Rockies shaped the American West is not just about geography, it is about human response to constraint. The mountains did not dictate everything. They offered resources as well as barriers. Gold, silver, copper, timber, and water all came from the Rockies. The mining booms of the late 19th century brought people to places like Leadville, Cripple Creek, and Butte. Those towns existed because the mountains held ore. The same mountains that blocked the wagon trains gave wealth to the miners. But the wealth came at a cost. Mining operations scarred the landscape, polluted rivers, and created boom-and-bust economies that left ghost towns behind. The Rockies shaped not only where people settled but how they lived. In isolation, dependent on unpredictable industries, subject to harsh winters and thin air. Even the culture of the American West has been influenced by the Rockies. The image of the lone cowboy, the rugged individualist, the frontier spirit, was forged in part by the experience of crossing or living in the shadow of the mountains. The vastness of the range instilled a sense of awe and danger. Writers like John Muir, who explored the Rockies later, described them as a cathedral. The mountains became a symbol of the untamed West. But the shaping was not only physical. The Rockies also shaped politics. The creation of national parks, starting with Yellowstone in 1872, was a direct response to the desire to preserve the mountain landscapes. The Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management both grew from the need to manage the resources of the Rockies. Water rights, a central issue in the West, revolve around the snowmelt from the Rocky Peaks. The Colorado River, the Rio Grande, the Missouri, the Platte all begin in the Rockies. Every city from Denver to Los Angeles depends on that water. The mountains shaped the legal framework of water allocation, a system that still determines who can grow crops and who must conserve. In the decades after the railroad was completed, the Rockies continued to assert their influence. The construction of highways, the expansion of tourism, the development of ski resorts all followed the contours of the range. The interstate highway system, built in the 1950s and 1960s, had to tunnel through or climb over the Rockies. The Eisenhower Tunnel, completed in 1973, is 11,000 feet above sea level, drilled through solid rock. The mountains did not stop the road builders, but they forced them to spend more money, take more time, and accept higher risk. So the event on that November morning in 1868, when a work train struggled up a frozen grade near Sherman's Summit, was a small moment in a larger story. It is easy to overlook, but it contains the central truth. The Rocky Mountains were not a passive backdrop. They were an active force pushing back against every inch of progress. and the American West from its cities to its railroads to its laws is the result of that pushback. At 5:17 p.m. on the 31st of May 1889, the South Fork Dam in western Pennsylvania gave way. More than 14 million cubic meters of lake water surged down the Little Kanemaw River. The flood reached Johnstown 40 minutes later, a wall of water and debris moving at 60 kilometers per hour. 2,200 people died. The disaster was not in the Rocky Mountains. It was in the Alleghenies, the eastern range. But the engineering failure that caused it had a direct link to the Rockies. The dam had been built to supply water for the Pennsylvania Main Line Canal, a system designed to move goods over the eastern mountains. The same logic of crossing mountains, of forcing water and trains through terrain that resisted them, would repeat in the West. And in the West, the stakes were higher because the mountains were bigger and the water scarcer. The floods that came later in the Rockies were not caused by dam failures alone. They were caused by the mountains themselves. On the night of the 31st of July 1976, the Big Thompson River flooded in Colorado. A thunderstorm stalled over the eastern slopes of the Rockies, releasing 300 millimeters of rain in less than 4 hours. The canyon funneled the water. The flood crest reached 8 meters in places. 143 people died. The event was not a random act of weather. It was a consequence of geography. The steep slopes of the Rockies force storms to rise and condense quickly. The narrow canyons concentrate runoff. The same mountains that had directed settlement and railroad construction also directed the path of destruction. How could this have happened? The National Weather Service had issued a flash flood watch earlier that day, but the warning did not reach many of the campers and tourists in the canyon. The roads were narrow. There was no escape route. The canyon walls rose straight up. When the water came, there was no place to go. The Big Thompson flood remains the deadliest flash flood in Colorado history. It is taught in hydrology courses as an example of how mountain terrain transforms ordinary rain into lethal water. The Rockies shaped not only the disasters but the response. After the Big Thompson flood, the state of Colorado overhauled its emergency warning systems. New floodplain regulations were enacted. But the fundamental problem remained. The mountains concentrate water. They also concentrate people. In the decades after the flood, more homes were built in canyons, more roads were carved into slopes. The same forces that had made the land attractive to miners and settlers now made it dangerous to live there. The risk did not stop the growth, it only changed the cost. On the 9th of March 1902, a winter storm caught a train of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad high in the San Juan Mountains. The train had departed from Durango headed for Silverton, a route that climbs through the Animas River Canyon. The snow fell at a rate of 30 centimeters per hour. The train was trapped near Needleton. Passengers waited for rescue. The crew tried to dig out, but the snow was too deep. By the time a relief train reached them 2 days later, 4 people had frozen to death. The railroad company had underestimated the mountain winter. It was not the first time. The San Juan Mountains are part of the Rocky Range, but they are among the most rugged. The peaks rise to 4,000 meters. The passes close for months. The railroad that runs through the canyon today, the Durango and Silverton narrow gauge, is a tourist line. It operates only in good weather. But in the early 20th century, it was a lifeline for mining towns. The same mountains that held the silver and gold also held the snow and the cold. The railroad had to fight the mountains every day. Avalanches wiped out track. Rock slides blocked tunnels. The company employed crews whose only job was to watch the slopes for snow movement and signal the trains to stop. The mountains did not care. In 1910, a series of avalanches in the Cascade Range killed more than 90 people near Stevens Pass. That was not the Rockies, but it illustrated the same principle. Mountain railroads were vulnerable to forces they could not control. The Rockies had similar disasters. On the 20th of February 1921, an avalanche struck a work train near the Moffett Tunnel in Colorado. The tunnel was being built to bypass the steep grades of the Front Range. The avalanche killed 23 workers, most of them sleeping in a camp near the tunnel portal. The bodies were not recovered until spring. The tunnel was completed anyway. It opened in 1928, finally allowing trains to cross the Continental Divide under the mountains, not over them. The cost in lives was accepted as necessary. What happened to those workers? They were immigrants, mostly Italian and Austrian. They lived in shacks built on unstable ground. The railroad company had not warned them of the avalanche danger. There had been signs: heavy snow, warming temperatures, recent slides in the area. The foreman had dismissed the risk. The investigation that followed was brief. The company paid a small settlement to families. The tunnel went on. The story of the Moffett Tunnel is often told as an engineering triumph. It is less often told as a human tragedy. The mountains shaped both. On the 24th of July 1972, a flash flood struck the town of Rapid City, South Dakota. The city sits at the eastern edge of the Black Hills, a separate range from the Rockies, but the same pattern held. Heavy rain fell on steep terrain. Canyon Creek and Rapid Creek overflowed. 238 people died. The disaster led to new dam construction and flood control measures. But again, the fundamental problem was the intersection of human settlements and mountain hydrology. The East Coast has its own mountain dangers. The West has them magnified. The Rockies have also shaped the way Americans think about water. The Colorado River begins in the Rocky Mountains, fed by snowmelt from peaks above 3,000 meters. The river supplies water to 7 states and Mexico. Its flow is allocated under the Colorado River Compact of 1922, an agreement based on assumptions about annual runoff that were too optimistic. The compact assumed the river would deliver an average of 20 million acre-feet per year. The actual long-term average is closer to 15 million. The difference has created a chronic deficit. Every city in the Southwest, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, depends on water that comes from the Rockies. The mountains do not produce enough to meet the demand. In the summer of 2002, the snowpack in the Colorado Rockies was the lowest in recorded history. The water level in Lake Powell fell by 30 meters. The drought that year was not a fluke, it was a precursor. Climate models project that the Rockies will lose up to 60% of their snowpack by the end of the 21st century. The consequences are not abstract. They mean less water for farms, less hydropower from dams, higher fire risk in the forests, and longer fire seasons. The Rockies shaped the legal and political framework of the West. Now that framework is being tested by changes in the mountains themselves. On the 5th of June 2013, the West Fork Complex fire ignited in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. It burned more than 400 square kilometers of forest. The fire was caused by lightning, but it was fed by drought and insect-killed trees. The beetles that had killed those trees were able to survive milder winters. The trees had not evolved to resist prolonged drought. The fire burned through timber that had never seen such an intense flame. The smoke reached as far as Kansas. The mountains had always been a place of fire, but this was different. The fire season was starting earlier and ending later. The fires were bigger. The mountains were changing. How could this have happened? The answer involves a cascade of factors. Warmer temperatures allowed pine beetles to reproduce faster. The beetles killed the trees, leaving dry fuel. Drought dried the soil and the undergrowth. Then a single lightning strike started a fire that could not be stopped. The fire reshaped the landscape. In the years after, flooding increased because the burned slopes could not absorb rain. The mudslides carried ash and debris into reservoirs. The water quality dropped. The mountains had shaped the West for centuries. Now human activity was shaping the mountains in return. On the 14th of November 2015, a mudslide buried a section of U.S. Highway 34 near the town of Estes Park, Colorado. The slide came from a hillside that had been burned in the 2012 High Park fire. Fire had stripped the vegetation. The roots that held the soil were gone. The autumn rain turned the ground into slurry. The slide was 20 meters deep in places. It took weeks to clear the road. The state spent millions on repairs. The mountains had delivered another reminder that they were not static. The Rockies have also shaped the economy of recreation. Ski resorts, hiking trails, national parks all draw millions of visitors each year. The mountains generate revenue, but they also generate risk. On the 21st of March 2014, an avalanche swept through a backcountry skiing area near Loveland Pass, killing 2 skiers. The snowpack that season was unstable. A layer of weak crystals had formed early in the winter, then been buried by later storms. The skiers knew the risk but misjudged the slope. The mountains do not forgive miscalculation. The cultural image of the Rockies is one of freedom and adventure. The reality is that the mountains are dangerous. The danger is part of why they are valued, but it is also part of why the settlement of the West was so difficult. Every pioneer, every miner, every railroad worker had to accept that the mountains could kill them. The ones who survived learned to read the landscape, to respect the weather, to plan for the worst. That attitude became part of the Western identity. On the 1st of August 1975, a debris flow from Mount Meeker in Rocky Mountain National Park destroyed a campground. A massive boulder the size of a car crushed a tent. 3 people died. The flow was triggered by a thunderstorm that released heavy rain on a steep, unstable slope. The Park Service had not warned campers about the risk because the hazard had not been mapped. After the disaster, geologists began a systematic survey of debris flow paths in the park. The survey revealed hundreds of potential slide zones. The park changed its camping policies, but the fundamental risk remained. The Rockies are still active. The range is rising slowly, about 2 millimeters per year, as the North American plate continues to push westward. The same tectonic forces that created the mountains millions of years ago are still at work. The mountains are not finished. They are still shaping the West. The question is whether the human systems built around them can adapt to what the mountains will become. On the 26th of April 2021, a rock slide on the Glenwood Canyon corridor of Interstate 70 closed the highway for 2 weeks. The slide dropped 40,000 tons of rock onto the road. The canyon had already been prone to rockfalls, but climate change was accelerating the process. Freeze-thaw cycles were more frequent. The rock was weakening. The Colorado Department of Transportation had to install new netting and barriers. The cost was $30 million. The slide was not a one-time event. It was a sign. The mountains shaped the American West in ways that are still unfolding. The railroads that crossed them, the cities that grew near them, the laws that allocated their water, the culture that celebrated their beauty, all of that came from the interaction between human ambition and geologic reality. The story is not over. The mountains are still pushing back, and the West is still responding. On the 24th of August 2021, the Bureau of Reclamation declared a Level 1 shortage on the Colorado River for the first time in history. The announcement came from the lower Colorado Basin region. The trigger was simple. The water level at Lake Mead had dropped below 1,075 feet above sea level. That threshold had been set years earlier in the 2019 Drought Contingency Plan. Now it was real. The declaration meant Arizona would lose about 120,000 acre-feet of water that year. Nevada would lose about 25,000. Mexico's allocation was also cut. The decision had been expected for months, but the official notice still carried weight. The river that begins in the Rocky Mountains was no longer enough to meet the commitments made in 1922. What happened? The Colorado River Compact of 1922 divided the river's flow between the upper basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, and the lower basin states, Arizona, Nevada, California. The allocation was based on a series of wet years in the early 20th century. The negotiators assumed the river would deliver an average of 20 million acre-feet per year. They did not account for the possibility of persistent drought. They did not know that tree ring reconstructions, done decades later, would show that the early 1900s were among the wettest periods in the last 1,200 years. The river they used as a baseline was an anomaly. The water they divided did not exist. By the 2010s, the average flow had dropped to about 12 million acre-feet per year. The gap between allocation and actual supply was not a temporary shortfall. It was structural. The two largest reservoirs on the river, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, were both below one-third of their capacity. The bathtub rings around their shorelines were visible from space. The mountains that feed the river were producing less snowpack, and the snow that did fall was melting earlier. The soil in the upper watershed was drier, so more of the meltwater was absorbed before it ever reached the creeks. The river was shrinking. How could this have happened? The answer is a combination of overallocation and climate change. The original compact was a political compromise, not a hydrological study. The states wanted to secure access to water for growth. The federal government wanted to enable development in the arid West. Everyone assumed the river would continue to deliver as it had during the wet years. They did not build in flexibility. When the drought began in the year 2000, it did not break after a few dry winters. It stretched into the longest drought in the region in more than a millennium. The mountains sent less water. The cities and farms kept taking more. The reservoirs dropped. The cuts finally had to come. The people affected by the shortage were not just farmers and ranchers. Cities like Phoenix and Tucson rely on Colorado River water piped through the Central Arizona Project. That canal carries water from the river across the desert. The shortage meant that Arizona's agricultural sector took the first hit. The state's water rights system is based on seniority. The oldest rights held by farmers in the Yuma area were protected. The newer rights held by cities and some tribal nations were cut. The farmers in central Arizona, many of whom grow alfalfa and cotton, lost access to water. Some fields were fallowed, others switched to less water-intensive crops. The economic impact rippled through the region. The tribal nations have a complicated relationship with the river. Many tribes, including the Navajo, the Hopi, the Ute, the Paiute, and the Cheyenne, have historically been excluded from the Colorado River Compact. Their water rights were not recognized until later court cases, and those rights have often been limited or contested. In 2021, the Gila River Indian community voluntarily left water in Lake Mead to help raise the lake level. That decision was a negotiation, not a gift. The tribe wanted federal funding for water infrastructure. The exchange was a sign that the old assumptions about who controls the water were shifting. The mountains did not care about the legal nuances. They simply sent less snow. On the 3rd of March 2022, the snowpack in the Colorado Rockies was measured at 70% of the historical average. The measurement was taken at the SNOTEL sites, automated stations that monitor snow depth and water content. The numbers were released by the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The low snowpack meant the spring runoff would be weak, reservoirs would not refill, the drought would continue. The forecasters noted that if snowpack remained below 70% for 2 consecutive years, the system would reach a point not seen since the 1930s Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was a natural disaster driven by drought and poor land management. This time, the drought was amplified by human-caused warming. On the 16th of June 2022, the Bureau of Reclamation gave the 7 basin states 60 days to come up with a plan to reduce water use by 2 to 4 million acre-feet per year. That was more water than the entire state of Nevada was allocated. The states could not agree. The deadline passed without a comprehensive deal. The federal government then threatened to impose cuts unilaterally. The negotiations continued behind closed doors. The mountains were not listening, they were losing snow. On the 1st of April 2023, the snowpack in the upper Colorado Basin was 150% of average. A series of winter storms had dumped heavy snow across the Rockies. The news was met with relief, but the relief was cautious. One wet year does not end a megadrought. Lake Mead rose by several feet, but it remained far below its capacity. The snow would melt fast in a warming spring. The infrastructure was not designed for rapid runoff. Dam operators had to release extra water from reservoirs to make room for the melt. The mountains were still shaping the west, but the pattern was becoming erratic. The story of the Colorado River is not only about water. It is about the cities that exist because of the river. Las Vegas, Nevada, sits in the Mojave Desert, one of the driest places in North America. The city receives about 4 inches of rain per year. Its population is over 2 million. The water comes from the Colorado River, pumped through a tunnel under Lake Mead. The tunnel was built in the 1970s. It is aging. In 2020, a leak forced a shutdown of one of the intake pipes. The city had to reduce water withdrawals. The repair cost millions. The vulnerability was exposed. The city that was built on the river's water now had to worry about the river's decline. On the 11th of July 2023, a debris flow in the San Juan Mountains of southern Colorado blocked the main road to the town of Silverton. The flow was triggered by a thunderstorm that dropped 2 inches of rain in 40 minutes. The slope above the road had been burned in the 416 fire in Tuesday Runite. The ash and soil slid down, burying the asphalt under several feet of mud and rocks. The road was closed for 3 days. The people of Silverton were used to being cut off. The town is isolated by the mountains, but the frequency of these events was increasing. The burned areas were not healing. The debris flows were becoming an annual occurrence. On the 22nd of September 2023, a wildfire in the Rocky Mountain National Park threatened the town of Estes Park. The fire started near the Bear Lake area. It was fought by 200 firefighters. The park was closed. The fire was contained after 3 days, but it burned 300 acres. The risk of large fires in the park had been growing for years. The Park Service had been conducting prescribed burns to reduce fuel, but the process was slow. The fire season was no longer confined to August and September. It started in May and sometimes lasted into November. The mountains were becoming a fire trap. The question of how to live in the Rockies has never been fully answered. The early settlers built towns in floodplains because the land was flat. They built railroads through canyons because the grade was gentle. They built dams on rivers because the water could be captured. Every decision came with a cost. The floods, the rockslides, the wildfires, the water shortages, all were consequences of ignoring the natural forces that created the mountains. On the 8th of January 2024, a mudslide in the town of Ophir, Colorado, destroyed 2 homes. Ophir is a small community in a narrow valley of the San Juan Mountains. The slide came after 3 days of rain on a snowpack that had melted partially. The ground was saturated. The hillside gave way. The residents had been warned by a geologist who had mapped the area and identified the slope as unstable, but no one had the authority to order an evacuation. The slide came at night. The families inside the homes survived because they heard the noise and ran. Their houses were buried. The response was local. The county declared a state of emergency. The state provided funds for cleanup. The families were displaced. The pattern is not random. It is the result of decades of building on unstable terrain. The Rockies are young mountains, geologically speaking. They are still rising. The erosion is still happening. The human infrastructure that crosses them is aging. The roads were built for a different climate. The bridges were designed for a different hydrology. The warnings from scientists have been accumulating for years. The mountains themselves are the messenger. On the 14th of February 2024, the Colorado Water Conservation Board released a report on the state's water future. The report projected that by 2050, the state would face a water supply shortfall of between 1 and 300,000 acre-feet per year. The shortfall would be worst in the South Platte and Colorado River basins. The causes were climate change, population growth, and agricultural demand. The report recommended conservation, new storage, and agricultural transfers, but the recommendations had been made before. The politics of water in the West are as slow as the erosion that shapes the valleys. On the 3rd of June 2024, the town of Cody, Wyoming, experienced a 100-year flood along the Shoshone River. The river rises in the Absaroka Range of the Rockies. The flood came from a rapid snowmelt combined with heavy rain. The river rose 4 feet above flood stage. Water poured into streets, inundated basements, and damaged bridges. The National Weather Service had issued warnings. The mayor declared a state of emergency. The damage was estimated at $20 million. The flood was not a 100-year event anymore. It was becoming a 20-year event. The mountains were changing the odds. The Rocky Mountains have shaped the American West in ways that go beyond the physical landscape. They have shaped the laws that govern water, the economics of energy and mining, the growth of cities, the culture of risk-taking, the identity of the people who live near them. The mountains are not a passive backdrop. They are an active force. Every rockfall, every flood, every wildfire, every drought is a reminder that the West is not a conquered territory. It is a negotiation. On the 22nd of November 2024, a rockslide on U.S. Highway 6 near Loveland Pass closed the road for 5 days. The slide dropped an estimated 10,000 tons of rock onto the highway. The rockfall came from a cliff face that had been weakened by repeated freeze-thaw cycles. The road crew had inspected the area 2 weeks earlier and seen no cracks. The slide happened without warning. No one was injured, but the road was the only direct link between the Denver metro area and the ski resorts of Summit County. The closure cost the local economy millions in lost tourism revenue. The mountains do not ask permission before they change. The story of the Rockies is not finished. The mountains will continue to erode, the snow will continue to decline, the fires will continue to burn, the water will continue to diminish. The human response will determine whether the West can adapt or whether it will break. The pioneer settlers believed they could conquer the mountains. They could not. The modern engineers believed they could control the rivers. They cannot. The mountains are not hostile, but they are indifferent. They do not care about the compacts, the dams, the subdivisions, or the roads. They simply are, and the West is still learning what that means. On the 31st of July 1976 at 7:30 p.m., a thunderstorm stalled over the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains near Estes Park, Colorado. The storm was not forecast to be severe. It was a typical summer afternoon storm, but it did not move. It remained stationary for 4 hours. The rain fell at a rate of 5 inches per hour. The ground was already saturated from previous rains. The Big Thompson River began to rise. At 8 p.m., the river was at normal levels. At 8:15 p.m., it jumped 2 feet. At 8:30 p.m., the National Weather Service in Denver issued a flash flood warning. The warning was broadcast on radio, but many people in the canyon had no radios turned on. The canyon is narrow, with steep walls and only one road, U.S. Highway 3. There was no siren system, no one knocked on doors. At 8:45 p.m., the first surge hit the town of Drake, a small community of cabins and houses clustered along the river. The water rose 12 feet in 10 minutes. Cars were swept off the road, trees were uprooted. People who saw the wall of water coming ran for higher ground, some made it, many did not. At 9 p.m., the second surge came, it was larger. The river crested at a flow of 31,000 cubic feet per second. Normal flow was about 100 cubic feet per second. The water carried boulders the size of cars. It destroyed bridges, ripped homes from their foundations, and scoured the canyon floor. The sound was described as a constant roar like a freight train, but deeper. By 9:30 p.m., the canyon was cut off. The road was gone in multiple places. Telephone lines were down. The only way in or out was on foot over the ridges. Rescue efforts could not begin until dawn. In the darkness, survivors huddled on slopes, listening to the water and the screams. What happened? The storm was a classic orographic thunderstorm fed by moist air from the Gulf of Mexico that was forced upward by the mountains. Normally, such storms move eastward. This one did not. A weak high-pressure system to the north blocked its movement. The storm recycled its own outflow, creating a self-sustaining system. It was a 1 in 10,000-year event, meteorologically speaking. But the disaster was not only the storm. The canyon had been heavily developed for tourism and second homes. Cabins were built in floodplains, roads ran along the riverbanks. There was no comprehensive floodplain management, no building codes required homes to be elevated, no warning system existed beyond the radio broadcast. The National Weather Service had issued the warning, but it reached too few people too late. Investigators later studied the event. They interviewed survivors, mapped the debris, and reconstructed the timeline. They found that the first surge caught most people by surprise. Many who survived did so because they were already outside and saw the water coming. Others heard the roar and ran. The death toll reached 143 people. 150 homes were destroyed. Hundreds of vehicles were lost. The damage was estimated at $37 million in 1976 currency. The aftermath brought change. The Big Thompson Canyon flood became a case study for flash flood preparedness. The National Weather Service improved its radar and forecasting. Local governments began adopting floodplain ordinances. The state of Colorado required new homes in floodplains to be built above base flood elevation, but the canyon was already built out. The scars of the flood are still visible. The event is remembered as one of the deadliest flash floods in American history. How could this have happened? The question is not about the storm itself, which was natural. It is about the failure to anticipate that a canyon in the Rockies could become a death trap. The mountains funnel water. The narrow valleys concentrate runoff. The river that looks gentle on a summer afternoon can become a monster in minutes. The human settlement of these canyons ignored that fact. The flood was a lesson, but lessons in the West are often learned only after disaster. The Big Thompson flood changed the way Colorado manages its mountain rivers. It led to the creation of the Colorado Flood Threat Assessment System. It pushed the state to require flood insurance for properties in floodplains. It also changed the public's perception of mountain streams, but the memory fades. New homes were built in the canyon again, some on the same lots. The river was given room in some areas, but not all. The mountains do not forget. The flood was not the first, and it would not be the last. On the 1st of June 2021, the town of Glenwood Springs faced a similar threat. A debris flow from the Grizzly Creek burn scar swept down Interstate 70. The flow came from a canyon that had burned in the 2020 wildfire. The rain was not extreme, only about half an inch in 30 minutes, but the burned ground repelled water. The mud and rocks moved at high speed. The highway was closed for hours. No one died, but cars were trapped. The event was a reminder that the combination of fire and rain in the Rockies is a deadly formula. On the 15th of July 2022, a flash flood in the city of Dulce, New Mexico killed 3 people. Dulce is at the base of the Jicarilla Mountains, a range that is part of the broader Rocky Mountain system. The flood came from a thunderstorm that dumped 3 inches of rain in 2 hours. The water came down from the mountains into the town. Homes were flooded. The victims were caught in their cars. The warning system in the area was limited. The event was small in scale but repeated a pattern. Mountain watersheds can turn deadly without warning. The Big Thompson flood also revealed a deeper problem, the gap between scientific knowledge and public awareness. After the flood, the U.S. Geological Survey conducted an extensive study of the rainfall, runoff, and debris. They published reports. The data was clear. The risk was real. But in the decades that followed, development in similar canyons continued. The population of Colorado grew. More people moved into foothills and valleys. The risk was not eliminated. It was only forgotten. On the 9th of September 2013, a statewide flood event struck Colorado. It was caused by a stalled weather system that drew moisture from the remnants of a Pacific hurricane. The rain fell for 5 days. The mountains received over 15 inches in some areas. The floodwaters came down the Front Range, hitting cities like Boulder, Leon, Longmont, and Greeley. The Big Thompson Canyon was hit again, but this time there was warning. The National Weather Service forecast the event days in advance. Evacuations were ordered. Nonetheless, 8 people died. The damage was over $2 billion. The flood was a 1,000-year event, but it happened less than 40 years after the 1976 flood. The odds were changing. What investigators found in 2013 was that the floodplains had been built up even more. The population had grown. The number of structures in harm's way had increased. The flood control infrastructure, including dams and levees, was overwhelmed. Some levees failed. The disaster was not a failure of prediction, it was a failure of land use. The mountains had delivered the water. The humans had put themselves in its path. The events of 1976 and 2013 are not isolated. They are part of a long history of flooding in the Rocky Mountain region. The Arkansas River flooded in 1921, killing over 100 people in Pueblo. The South Platte River flooded in 1965, killing 28 in Denver. The Powder River flooded in 1904. The records go back. The mountains produce extreme rainfall events. The geography concentrates them. The settlements that grew along the rivers were built with a false sense of security. The question that remains is whether the West can learn to live with these events. The answer is not simple. Floodplains are attractive for development because they are flat, fertile, and scenic. The cost of building away from rivers is higher. The political will to restrict development is low. The memory of the last disaster fades within a generation. The Big Thompson flood is now taught in schools, but the town of Estes Park has expanded. New subdivisions have been built in the same watershed. On the 20th of June 2023, a debris flow in the town of Taponas, Colorado, damaged a home. Taponas is in a narrow valley between the flat tops and the Gore Range. The flow came after a wildfire in 2022 that burned the hillside above. The homeowners knew the risk. They had installed a small retention wall. It was not enough. The mud and rocks pushed through the wall and into the basement. No one was hurt. The family was displaced for months. The county had no funds to mitigate the slope. The fire had changed the landscape, but the mountain had not settled. The Rocky Mountains shaped the West not only through water but through fire. The forests of the Rockies evolved with fire. The ponderosa pine, the lodgepole pine, the spruce fir forest all depend on periodic burns to regenerate, but a century of suppression has created dense forests of dead and dying trees. The result is catastrophic fires that kill the soil. The burned slopes then shed water and sediment at rates that exceed anything natural. The debris flows that follow are a direct consequence of what the mountains used to do regularly: burn and regrow. On the 8th of October 2020, the Cameron Peak Fire burned over 200,000 acres in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. It was the largest wildfire in state history. It burned for months. The fire was so intense that it created its own weather. Pyrocumulonimbus clouds formed. Fire tornadoes were observed. After the fire, the watersheds were devastated. The Cashlaw Powder River carried ash and sediment for years. The water treatment plants had to increase filtration. The cost of the fire exceeded $150 million in suppression alone, not counting the long-term damage. The same mountains that provide water to the west also provide the fuel for its fires. The same slopes that channel runoff into reservoirs also channel ash into drinking water. The systems are linked. The disaster of a fire is followed by the disaster of a debris flow. The two are connected by the mountains themselves. On the 12th of June 2024, a debris flow along the Cache La Powder Canyon closed Highway 1 for. The flow came from the Cameron Peak burn scar. It was triggered by a thunderstorm that dropped 1 inch of rain in 20 minutes. The flow carried boulders, logs, and mud. The road was buried under 5 feet of material. The closure lasted 2 days. The crews had to bring in heavy equipment to clear it. The same stretch of road had been closed multiple times since the fire. Each time the mountain released a little more debris. The burn scar was not healing as fast as expected. The ground had been sterilized by the fire. The roots were dead. The regrowth was slow. What happens when these events become annual? The roads are rebuilt each time. The insurance companies raise premiums. Some homeowners decide to leave, but many stay. They have no other home. The land is all they have. The mountain is all they know. The history of the Rocky Mountains is a history of repeating patterns. The early explorers noted the floods and fires. The first settlers built along the rivers and lost their homes. The railroads were washed out. The mines were abandoned. The cycle continued. The difference now is the scale. The population is larger. The infrastructure is more expensive. The climate is changing. The patterns are becoming more frequent. On the 4th of July 2024, a wildfire near the town of Creede, Colorado, threatened the historical district. Creede is a small mining town in the San Juan Mountains. The fire was started by a lightning strike. It grew quickly because of dry conditions. Firefighters from the San Juan National Forest responded. The town was evacuated for 2 days. The fire burned 1,200 acres. No structures were lost, but the threat was real. The town had been through this before. The mines that once provided jobs were gone. The economy was tourism. The fire season determined whether the visitors came. The Rocky Mountains have also shaped the West through mining. The gold and silver rushes of the 19th century brought thousands of people into remote valleys. The towns that sprang up were often built on unstable ground. Mine tailings were dumped into rivers. The pollution remains. The water that flows from abandoned mines is sometimes toxic. The mountains hold their history in their streams. On the 5th of August 2015, the Gold King mine spill released 3 million gallons of mine waste into the Animas River in Colorado. The spill came from an Environmental Protection Agency crew that was working to seal the entrance of the mine. They accidentally breached a plug. The water inside the mine, laden with heavy metals like lead, cadmium, and arsenic, surged out. The river turned orange. The contamination flowed downstream into New Mexico and Utah. The river was closed to recreation and drinking water for weeks. The disaster highlighted the legacy of 100 years of mining in the Rockies. The mountains had been carved open and the wounds were still bleeding. The response to the Gold King mine spill was slow. The EPA took responsibility, but lawsuits dragged on for years. The local economies along the Animas suffered. The tourism season was ruined. The fishermen lost their season. The question of who pays for the damage caused by a 100-year-old mine is still unanswered. The mountains are full of such sites. There are estimated to be over 20,000 abandoned mines in Colorado alone. Many are not sealed. Many are still leaking. The Rocky Mountains are not only a source of water and fire. They are also a source of history, of memory, of identity. The people who live in the West define themselves by the mountains. They see themselves as tough, independent, willing to endure hardship. The mountains reinforce that image. But the hardship is not optional. It is imposed by geology and weather. The West is not a paradise. It is a desert crossed by mountains. Those mountains provide the water that makes life possible, but they also take it back. On the 22nd of December 2024, a deep freeze in the Rocky Mountains caused power outages across the Front Range. The cold was driven by a polar vortex that slipped south over the mountains. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit in Denver, -30 in the foothills. The power grid, already strained by growing demand, failed in some areas. People without heat had to seek shelter. The mountains had sent the cold air down. The cities were not built for such extremes. The infrastructure was designed for a milder climate. The question of adaptation is now urgent. The Rocky Mountains are a laboratory for how humans can live in a changing world. The lessons from the past are clear. Do not build in floodplains. Do not build on burn scars. Do not rely on a single source of water. Do not assume that the future will look like the past. But those lessons are difficult to apply. The political system favors development. The economic system favors growth. The social system favors denial. And so the pattern continues. Another storm will stall over a canyon. Another wildfire will burn through a forest. Another mudslide will bury a road. Another drought will lower a reservoir. The mountains will keep shaping the West. The question is whether the West will shape itself to the mountains or continue to fight against them. The answer will not come from a single event. It will come from the accumulated weight of many. On the 2nd of March 2025, the Colorado River Basin received below-average snowfall for the 5th consecutive year. The snowpack was measured at 60% of normal. The reservoirs were still low. The cities were still growing. The farmers were still irrigating. The mountains held less snow than they had in a generation. The summer would bring more fire, less water, more risk. The cycle was not breaking, it was accelerating. The Rocky Mountains have always been a test of human ingenuity and resilience. The first people to live in their shadow, the Ute, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, understood that the mountains were not to be conquered. They moved with the seasons. They followed the game, they used the passes for trade. They did not build permanent structures in the floodplains, they did not dam the rivers, they lived within the limits. The modern West has tried to exceed those limits. The mountains are reminding them that the limits still exist. On the 15th of April 2025, a rockslide in the Black Canyon of the Gunnison River blocked the only access road to the national park. The slide was estimated at 50,000 tons. It fell from a vertical cliff face that had been weakened by frost wedging. The road was closed for 2 weeks. The park rangers had to airlift visitors out. The mountain had made its own decision. The park would open when the mountain allowed it. The story of the Rocky Mountains is not a story of human achievement. It is a story of human accommodation. The mountains will continue to erode. The snow will continue to melt. The fires will continue to burn. The floods will continue to surge. The West will continue to adapt or it will not. The mountains are indifferent. They do not care. They simply are, and the West is still learning what that means. On the 10th of May 2025, a flash flood swept through the town of Jamestown, Colorado at 3:47 in the afternoon. The storm was not exceptional by itself. 2 inches of rain fell in just over an hour. But the ground above the town was still scarred from the 2020 Calwood fire. The burn scar had not recovered. The soil could not absorb the water. The runoff carried ash, mud, and boulders down a narrow canyon. The flood hit the town without warning. A wall of debris 4 feet high tore through the main street. Cars were pushed into houses. The post office was flooded. A dozen residents had to be rescued by helicopters. No one died, but the damage was severe. What happened in Jamestown was not random. It was the direct consequence of a wildfire that had burned through the watershed 5 years earlier. The fire had killed the vegetation that held the soil. Without roots, the ground became like pavement. When rain fell, it all ran off. The floodplain had been built over decades. The town had been rebuilt after the 2013 flood. That flood was also tied to a burn scar, the 2010 Formal Canyon fire. The pattern repeated. Each fire was followed by floods. Each flood was followed by rebuilding. The mountain was not forgiving. Emergency managers had known the risk. They had installed early warning systems upstream. They had cleared debris basins. But the scale of the flood exceeded what was expected. The debris came too fast. The warning systems gave only minutes of notice. The residents who survived said they heard a roar before they saw the water. The mountain had taught another lesson. The question now is how many times a community can rebuild. Jamestown is a small town. Its population is about 250. The tax base is narrow. The fire department is volunteer. The road that connects the town to Boulder is often closed after storms. Each rebuilding costs money. Federal aid is available, but it takes time. Some residents have sold their homes and moved. Others have stayed. They say the mountain is their home. They say they know the risk, but the risk is growing. On the 18th of June 2025, the National Weather Service issued a flash flood watch for all burn scars along the Front Range. It was the earliest such watch in recorded history. The snowpack had melted early. The monsoon season was predicted to be active. The mountains were ready to release more destruction. The Rocky Mountains have always been a machine of erosion. They are young mountains still rising. The uplift creates steep slopes. The slopes shed material naturally, but fire and human settlement accelerate the process. The burn scars are the new normal. The floods that follow are the consequence. The West is now living in the aftermath of an entire century of fire suppression. The forests are dense. The fires are hotter, the scars are larger, the floods are worse. On the 5th of July 2025, a mudslide closed Interstate 70 near Glenwood Canyon for the 3rd time that year. The slide came after a slow-moving thunderstorm dropped 3 inches of rain in 2 hours on the Grizzly Creek fire burn scar, the same scar that had produced the massive debris flow in 2020. The highway was shut for 4 days, trucks were stuck, tourists slept in their cars. The economic loss was estimated at $20 million. The highway is the primary east-west corridor through the Rockies. It cannot be moved. The canyon is narrow. The mountain is steep. The road will continue to be buried. The state of Colorado has spent over $100 million since 2020 on debris mitigation in Glenwood Canyon. They have built catchment basins, they have installed nets, they have improved monitoring, but the mountain keeps sending more material. The runoff from a burn scar can last for a decade or more. The structural solutions are temporary. The mountain is patient. What does this mean for the future of the West? The infrastructure that connects the region is vulnerable. The highways, the railroads, the power lines, the pipelines, all of them traverse steep terrain. All of them are at risk from floods, fires, and landslides. The cost of maintaining them is rising faster than tax revenue. The insurance industry is pulling back. Some companies have stopped writing new policies in wildfire-prone areas. The risk is being privatized. The burden falls on homeowners. In the Rocky Mountains, the old ways are returning. People are learning to live with mobility. They are buying trailers instead of houses. They are keeping their possessions packed. They are watching the weather. They are checking the burn scar maps. They are listening for the roar. On the 20th of August 2025, the town of Est Park evacuated 3,000 people ahead of a predicted flood from the 2024 East Troublesome Fire Scar. The evacuation was voluntary. Many residents left immediately, some stayed. The flood did not materialize. The storm moved north. But the memory of the 2013 flood was still fresh. The people knew that the mountain could decide at any moment. The Rocky Mountains are not a backdrop. They are an active participant in the life of the West. They generate the water, they generate the fire, they generate the flood, they generate the risk. The West is beginning to understand that it cannot outrun the mountain. It can only adapt. Each new event is a lesson. Each lesson costs money, time, and sometimes lives. The mountain does not write the lessons. It only delivers them. The West must learn or repeat.